Here we go now. Great. So we're doing the financial policies and procedures part one. Next week, we'll do the part two of the financial policies and procedures. What we have for our agenda, we'll be talking about policies, procedures, and how-tos. But before that, let's discuss just policies and procedures. Policies and procedures have been around for decades. Whether you were in the old system, the OMB circulars, or whether you're in now with the new system, which is the 2 CFR Part 200, which consolidated all of the circulars into one. That's one of the things about policies and procedures. It's been around. Also, the other part of policies and procedures, a lot of organizations use that for their employee handbook, so which could also be considered like an HR policies and procedures. So there's different kind of policies and procedures. What policies and procedures are is just trying to give you a representation of your whole organization's process. And that's what we would like to use for policies and procedures. So now we're going to be talking about policies, procedures. Some of y'all may have heard about the how-tos, but we're kind of introducing them at this time. I think that's kind of an area where you can do a lot of things. One reason that I like to have policies, procedures, and how-tos, policies and procedures are reviewed by your organization and approved by your board. So it takes time. Even though policies and procedures are a living document, it's slow in its process. And if you're doing things in there by policies and procedures, and you've changed something and deviated from something, then in order to be in compliance with your own policies and procedures, which auditors look at, you would need to go back and have those changes reviewed by your CEO or your organization's management, and then reviewed and approved by your board. Typically with policies and procedures, there's that kind of step of, the organization does the policies and procedures, then it goes up for management's review within the organization. And then as it's going through management review, usually an attorney will be consulted in that point just to make sure that any of your policies and procedures are not conflicting with law at that point. And then once that's done, it's actually given to the board for the board to review, and they may again have legal look at it, but typically you only need to have legal one time review that to make sure. And then it finally is approved by the board and it's implemented across the board. So it does take more time. That's why using how-tos kind of helps in that direction. You take a lot of things that were real detailed, primarily more in your procedures than your policies, and you move them into how-to documents, which is a living document. It could be a lot of different things, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So that's where the how-to documents have come about, and they could be in different things as we talk about it. For this particular webinar, we're going to be talking about time and effort reporting, internal controls, conflict of interest, mandatory disclosures, and travel. The big parts that usually get organizations into non-compliance are more the time and effort reporting and the travel. But the other three, the internal controls, conflict of interest, and mandatory, are something that you need to have just in case things start having problems in that situation. So the acronyms that we have over here, most of us know the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. UGG, you might hear that from different training organizations and periodicals, other things. That's basically the shorthand for the 2 CFR Part 200, with a real long name of of the Part 200. So people a lot of times will just call it UGG. So if you hear somebody say that, or if you read and you see they're talking about UGG, that is 2 CFR Part 200. Naturally, some people have CEOs and CFOs. Other organizations have EDs and, let's say, financial managers. So they kind of interchange. SEO is a state auditor's office, and we'll use that after a while. And then for this particular presentation, instead of saying same organization or whatever else like that, we're just using XYZ as the name of the organization. Now, as we talked about the employee handbook and then the financial policies and procedures, those are the two main parts. Well, for 2 CFR, it pertains to the financial policies and procedures. And it's been around even before the 2 CFR, back into the OMB circulars that we just talked about. But back in the OMB circulars, where you found the areas of emphasis for policies and procedures were actually in the audit circular, which was A133. Well, now that everything's been consolidated into the 2 CFR, what they did was they made a point of inference to make this more of a case for people that this is something that the government really wants as an emphasis in that. So the emphasis is primarily, mitigating fraud, waste, and abuse. That's the biggest part of what the 2 CFR. If you're in compliance with that, then you've mitigated your fraud, waste, and abuse. In order to do that for fraud, waste, and abuse, the 2 CFR has the emphasis of internal control. Like I said before, that used to be in the OMB circulars, A133. It's now been moved up into the post-award area and throughout the 2 CFR. So it's become a much stronger area that the government wants in one sense. And when you talk about internal controls, the best way to show that you have internal controls are really, they're being documented by the policies and procedures. So it's almost like, well, policy and procedures equals internal control, but it's really the documentation of your internal control. And then again, as we talked about, for any of those policies and procedures, they will need to be reviewed by legal and then approved by your board. So that's kind of where we're going with the 2 CFR and the financial policies and procedures. Now, policies should be very broad. It's a broad statement or broad guiding principles. One that we don't have in here, but it's a pretty good example, would be the accrual base of accounting. Accrual base of accounting is in compliance with the general accepted accounting principles. So you can actually make a broad statement as your policy that your organization uses the accrual accounting basis, which is in compliance with the with GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. That would be the whole policy right there. It's pretty broad and kind of short in one sense. Where I see people having more issues across the board is we really like to write a lot. And in this situation, policy should be kind of brief, maybe a paragraph long or so. And it should be done by the management team and staff, because really the organization's the one that knows the intricacies of your organization. And you start setting that up. Management team could include the CEO or just the supervisors, and then the CEO might be where it goes past the management team in that part. But that's how you start to develop it. And try to remember that as we talk about that, it should be very broad and should be, short in that degree, because if you get so detailed, there's a possibility that your organization may have skipped a step, and then you'd be out of compliance with your own policies and procedures, which would be an audit finding by the auditors. Now, on the other side, procedures should be drafted by the staff, because the staff really knows what procedures they need to do to keep the organization going, either financially or programmatically or other things like that. But financially, it would be, how do you record things to use besides generally accepted practices, you might be using QuickBooks or other things like that. That's where the detail comes in, and that's where you start to do your process. Now, process is really procedures are kind of process oriented. It should complete the process, but it shouldn't be so detailed, because I've seen procedures that might be 2, 3, 4 pages long. And if you have to update one part of that, you're going to have to go through the whole process again of having your policies and procedures reviewed, approved, legal, and then approved by the board. And that takes a lot of time. So that's why I like to keep those procedures still kind of manageable and kind of to a smaller sense and everything. So that's how you go about with your policies and procedures. Board review would be the thing. And we still call policies and procedures a living document, but it's a long-term thing. It's just like you think of an airliner that just goes along. When you want to turn and pivot, it takes a long time to turn and move in a different direction. So that's where, if you focus in on your policies and your procedures to make it broad enough, still to complete the process, but not so detailed that you get bogged down. Now, the how-to documents, those are the ones where it's very detailed. And it could be anything from, let's say, timesheets. How do you do timesheets? Who is involved in the review process? A lot of different things like that. At the same time, it could be very repetitive, because you do one step, you go down to the next step, and then the next thing would be, well, if it's not right, if you see an error, then you go back to the first step and repeat the process. So that's why you may see in sometimes your how-to documents being repetitive in that regard. One of the good things with how-to documents, you can use a lot of different things to do that. You can use flow charts to flow your process down. How does it go from A to B to C in that direction? And I'll show you something in a minute. Flow charts can be very detailed, or they could be very simple, depending on the process itself. Spreadsheets are the same way. You can have a spreadsheet that sets up the process, and you can use that as your how-to document. One of the things in there, using how-to documents, it's okay to have the staff titles. The only issue with staff titles is that with a lot of organizations, there's quite a bit of organizational change. And within that organizational change, staff titles may be changed at the same time. So in that situation, then you'd have to go back to your how-to documents and update staff titles if they have changed. It's better to do that in your how-to documents than it is in your procedures or even in your policies. That's why you want, like I said, the other two broad. This would be kind of more your detail part. And then one of the last things of your how-to documents can be specific forms that you use, that you fill out, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. But it gets you down to that detailed part for the process. Now, let me see if I can my mouse to move and stop share for a second. It's my going to look at in just a second is a flow chart. Can everybody see this flow chart? Roger, can you see it? You're muted, Roger, so
Sorry.
either one.
Yes,
That's
yeah,
it.
yeah. I can see
Okay,
it.
so everybody can see this.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of more of a detailed flow chart. It could be, like I said, a lot more simple than this, but it's a good process. As you can see, it actually does a step-by-step process, which a lot of procedures do at the same time. Now you've just incorporated it into a smaller thing. You don't have to use as much text involved in this process, but you still fill out everything that you need. And in this case, this is a planning review document. So when Roger and I start audit engagements, this is kind of some of our processes that we do. Naturally, we get the assignment from either a risk assessment or anything. So we identify the organization that we're going to go to. We determine the type of assignment. It could be a desk review. It could be an on-site. It could be TA. That's one of those areas. And as we determine that, then we go out to the side and look at other documents like requests for reimbursements, determining the period of availability as a review, what year are we going to use, what other things like that, and notifying the grantee. So at that point of this part, we start notifying the organization that a sub-recipient monitoring engagement will start. And from there, you can start to see how we do that. We set up files, working files to start things. We look at our standard program, audit program that we do, and we start to look at it, modify it if we need to for specific reasons. One of the big things that could change is that an example of a plan audit program is that the audit program is for everybody, all kinds of things that happen. Well, one of the things that could be is if you're a faith-based organization, there is a section of it that we need to deal with. Well, if you're not a faith-based organization, then we normally take it out of the planning program because it's not relevant at this point. So that's why we would then tailor make that. And as we do that for our program, then we start to go back and look at background information again. We look at cost allocation. Was there an audit done? Was it a single audit? What were the payment histories and any kind of program evaluations or comments from our grant managers, everything like that. So we're picking up a lot of information before we even start. And then we start with the review to get that information out. We email the grantee about where we want to be, what's the start and everything, which means now we're selecting and testing data. So that data could be 1 month, could be a quarter, could be a year. We start going through that process. And then we just develop the on-site work plan, or whether we stick to more a generic that might be for both on-site and desk reviews. So this is kind of the process that we go through. And this would be a good example of a detailed how-to document. So let me get out of there. We'll come back here. Okay, Roger, can you see the how-to document and the slide at this point? You're still mute. Can you see this going up and down?
Yes.
Okay, so we've done procedures.
Right. Now we
how-to document.
Okay. Now I don't see anything. So do you have anything on the screen?
Yeah, but let me see if I can go back and start right. Should be screen one, but let me see if I can do that. I may have to go back out.
There you go. You're back on to slide number 1.
Okay, so now I just need to put it into training. Okay, so now we're on how-to documents. We just talked about that, and we've also had that attached document, which was a flow chart. So now we can start with our policies and procedures. Now, one of the first policies, because 80 to 95% of most programs or grant awards are in personnel. That's why you really need to have a time and effort policy and procedures. That's where we see a lot of audit findings is in there. So how do you go about that? How do you document it? Things like that. Again, I was talking about having a broad kind of policy. And in this case, when you look at that, we're talking about the AYZ provides a system of internal controls where it provides reasonable assurance to reflect the total activities for the compensated employees. So that means we're talking about, we have a system of internal controls, which are typically timesheets or electronic timesheets or whatever, time and effort reports is basically what is kind of talked about. And that's a broad statement, but that's where we want to go. And then the total activities should encompass both federal and non-federal activities. So it's either, like you can say, restricted funds and non-restricted funds. It's everything that employee is doing for the work and getting compensated for should be captured in there. So as you can see, this is a pretty broad statement that encapsulates everything that you need as a policy. You can wordsmith it in different ways. I put it into bullets for here. It could be just one paragraph. You could add a little bit. Wordsmithing it is one of the things I always talk about. So that's a policy. And as you can see, that 200.430 with the I and the 1, I put it up there so that if you need to go back and look at the specific citation, you have it from your handouts and you can actually go from there. You don't have to look at 500 pages to find out, well, what do I do for time and effort? This is one of the areas in there. So there's your policy. The procedures still should complete the process. So what, in this case, I'm using TASA as an example, but you could use anybody, whether it is spreadsheets or electronic timesheets that could be in that situation. So in here in our procedure, employees are using electronic timekeeping to report time and effort. That's the process. It should include everything, 100% of the total activities that are in there. So your cost and what you're charging and the time and effort goes in there. And then in that same thing is it's 100% and it includes total activities performed. So that's where you get both your time and your effort into your reporting. And then to close everything for this procedure is that both employees and supervisors should review and approve the time and effort reporting. How do you do that? There's different ways. There's a part where you can go, let's say, to spreadsheets where you have signature parts. You have areas that will show for activities in that situation. And what I'm going to do, let's pause this for a second if I can get my mouse to cooperate. Let me log in first. Okay, so I'm pulling up our specific time and effort reporting, which is called Time Clock Plus. And let me see if I can share it for y'all. And this will kind of provide you with the procedures and kind of the how-tos, which we'll talk about in just a minute. This will be kind of the how-to. Roger, can you now see the time and effort time clock plus?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So in this case, we use an electronic version of timesheets and everything. As you can see, it's for the week that we have. We have the time and effort that's there, the 8 hours that's broken up. For me, mine's pretty simple because I'm on 2 grants and I do the same thing in both grants, so I don't have to break it up. For other groups and all that, advocates, other things like that, you may be multiple funded, so you may have a couple of these, or you may even be split funded, but you may say that for 4 hours we did, let's say, vocal work, and then another 2 hours we did OHE work, and then, oh, by the way, at the end of the day, we went with 4 hours of VOCA. Then you would split these up. So your time and effort could actually be several different things. Now, for us, we only log in the time that we do. What you see that's missing is actually the half hour that we have for lunch, but it's calculated into the process. So it goes across in this direction. For the employee to accept it, we'd come up here and hit accept. In that situation, that's part of the employee review. The manager will review this and start to accept it. What we do from there is we actually go up here and we look at our work product and things. From here, we have notes that go in for the time and effort that we did. Mine is primarily more technical assistance, professional development, sometimes grants management in there, training. If we're like today, I'll be logging in and I'll put a Q code for training in that process. And at the same time, as we finish during the day, then I click as my approval for the time that's in there. And then the manager comes in and looks at it and then approves it. Well, this was from the last month. We're just starting this week, and the manager will then go back and approve it. And what you can see in some of these, I'll just go ahead and go to one. Here we had justified leave, which was actually a holiday. So we put that in there, why that was the part. You go down further. Oh, I think that's this week. Let's go down to another one. Let's go down over here, TA. So in my case, TA could be doing a technical assistance review, could be handling emails and discussing things, could be a conference call, could be, you know, a Zoom training for a specific organization. That's all TA. So in my notes, it would be this. If it was broken into different things, I might have TA during that particular 6 hours, professional development. It could be training that I did 2-hour training within those 6 hours. So what we do is we put our notes in where we have initials to describe what they are. And then we have another document that actually tells us what is TR, what is TA, what is JL is the justified leave, or PTO is another. So that's how we document our activities that we do. And all of this is included as your time and effort reporting. Now, we have another part, which we call Salesforce, is that even though I might show one thing of TA over here like that, in Salesforce, I would actually put in the different organizations that have provided technical assistance. And I would put in that part, what kind of technical assistance was it a conference call? Was it cost allocation? Things like that. So it kind of controls and it closes the whole process down. So it's all documented. In this case, we actually have it in 2 different systems, one for time and effort, and then the other one for actually our deliverables. Okay, let me go back here. There. Okay, Roger, can you see? And it looks like it took me all the way back to the beginning. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, I
Okay,
can
so
see. Yeah.
let's go to, I'll just do from the beginning. So that's part of your time and effort procedures. You can see how it's not so detailed here, where the detail comes down is into the next one, which is our how-tos, which I kind of talked about. Now I thought it'd be easier to show you everything, and now we can go back, and when you see the different bullets, it makes a little bit more sense. So we have time clock plus, it has a 40 hours. Well, when you looked across for each week, it should register 40 hours. In that case, if we have more than 40 hours or we anticipate 40 hours, then we will just, adjust our time and effort so that within those days that we stay within the 40 hours and not work the extra where, we potentially could have overtime or other things like that. So that's one part. Again, as you can see over there, it showed the different funding sources that I had. I had two in this situation. You can see that in the management time part, that was the part where it went across the board, how many hours per day that we were working. And then in the other part of it, which was the view hours, that's our effort. So time management was the time part of the time and effort, and view hours was actually the effort part, and it looks at that. From here, you can see with our document that it's electronically verified by both by the employee and the manager that's doing that. And we would do it in both the time management section and the view hours section. And then finally, the supervisor would review that time section and reviewed section, and then electronically verify everything off of the reviewed hours section. So that's kind of the whole thing of your policy, your procedure, and your how-to. You can see how the how-tos get a lot more into detail. Now, the next policy is internal controls. And this, like I was talking about earlier, is that internal controls have moved up to a predominant part of the grants guidance. It used to be, like I said, in the OMB circulars, you could see that in the audit section, but now it's in the post awards, your cost allocation, and your audit section in that. And this has been a big shift to that direction from the old OMB circulars to the 2 CFR. What they want to know is, do you have a system of internal controls? And the system of controls due to the 2 CFR is to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse. That's the big part of what the government's been going for all these years. I'm not too sure if everybody has known that the 2 CFR is now 10 years old. So 11 years ago, we were still using the OMB circulars. It took many years and probably a couple of administrations, presidential administrations, to go from the circulars in the 2 CFR. The 2 CFR actually, when it was finally done and implemented, was in the Obama administration and has gone forward through the other two administrations now. But the predominant theme is internal controls. How do you do the internal controls? You document your policies and procedures. What do you want to do is we want to mitigate fraud, waste, and abuse, and we want to adhere to any regulations, whether it's the notice of award, internal controls for your grant compliance, areas like that. What the big thing about this with internal controls is we need to always think about providing reasonable assurance. It's not absolute assurance. There are going to be times people make mistakes, errors happen and all that. But a good internal control will catch that in a timely manner, which could be a month or 2 months or whatever. That's short, but it doesn't impact the organization severely. So that's your policy. Again, it's very broad. And it leads you to the next part of things, your procedures here. Well, what are some of your procedures that you would use for internal control? Well, one thing would be to have the board treasurer and the CEO consult with the financial manager or the CFO on the accounting records like QuickBooks, your general ledgers, other things like that. That would be part of it because you'll be using that to adjust for your procedures for internal controls. The other part of that is the conflict of interest. We'll talk about that after a while. Conflict of interest is there and you should use it, but if your organization's going very well and you're in compliance, you shouldn't have that big issue about conflict of interest. I'll give you an example where it doesn't. And then within the internal controls section for your procedures financially, you should have a place where the staff will know that if they can't get things cured by either their supervisor, the management team, or the CEO, that they can go to the next step, which would be the board. And if it's not taken care of in that situation, then there's always the part that you can go to the state auditor's office. You'd like to keep it internally instead of the state auditor's office, because when you get there, a lot of people get involved in that process. I know Roger and I have seen it as he was the director, I was the director, and he became the director of the federal audits at TEA. There would be somebody that felt like they didn't get heard or that there was an issue that wasn't resolved. They would go to the state auditor's office and they would complain with that. Well, the state auditor's office actually doesn't do that work. They source it out to the relevant organization or agency. So if it was a school district, then it would come to TEA. At TEA's time, then it came to Roger and I for us to figure out, do we need to investigate this? If we do, then, and it's true, what do we do to help cure the process? What recommendations do we do for TEA to work with the school district, and what does the school district do to resolve the problem? That would be those big, broad things. You really hate to see it go out that far, especially for a nonprofit, because once it gets out that direction, what happens is usually it's in the front page of the local newspaper. And all that does is really damage the organization because it's hard to get contributions, donations, other things like that. And then through this procedure for internal controls, you want to go ahead and review them at least annually. See if you need to update them. You may not, but at least go through and say, okay, let's do our due diligence. Then the how-to document is created this way so that you could get into more of the detail part of it. And the detail part is naturally you're looking at it. What is the process to report fraud, waste, and abuse? Who does it go to? Where does it go from there? And then does it go up to the CEO, or does it go to the board in that situation? So you'd have some more detail there. The board could create a conflict of resolution, which is involved in these kind of situations, where if that conflict doesn't get resolved by the organization itself, the management team or the CEO, and it goes to the board, what process does the board have to resolve those? Specifically, if it's fraud, waste, and abuse, but any kind of conflict or resolution. I've worked with organizations to think about in their board, identifying one board member that could be identified and given the job of like an ombudsman. A board member that where any staff person can go to if they have not felt resolved from the process internally. You want to start there. That board member needs to be, a person that you can trust so that it doesn't get past the board member unless you still need to do a resolution to that conflict, which would then mean that that board member would go to the board and then they would work on that process. So it kind of, these how-to documents may be either forms, diagrams, flowcharts, or other things like a spreadsheet where you have the instance and then you click off which things you may need to go to. So that's how you create that type of how-tos for internal controls. Conflict of interest. That's a big part of the organization. Very rarely do we see that happening in that situation, but it can. Let me give you the first example, and that's when I was at the OAG Office of the Attorney General, and we used to go and review nonprofits for issues and everything. One of the things about conflict of interest, and this is back in the 80s when I was doing that, there were a lot of organizations were having trouble. A lot of vendors were going bankrupt, everything else. It was a time when the economy was real bad. Well, some investors or real estate people decided, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a nonprofit. And yes, it's a good nonprofit for working on that, but I will rent the space out to that nonprofit. And that's okay if it's at face value or below face value. But the investigations that we had was that that was the way the realtor or the owner would supplement his income by saying, well, we're going to rent this facility at twice the market value, which is a big issue when there's so much facilities out there at that time that were not being used. You could have gotten a very good rate on that. That would be a conflict of interest because, oh, by the way, that person was on the board and was the one that was the focal point of getting that contract for the facilities. That's what conflict of interest is, basically. So you want to write something that policy that your board will look at any potential conflict of interest. It's very broad again in that process. Again, there's 200.113. So if you really want to look at conflict of interest and what does the citation actually say, you can go there quickly. Now, on the procedures part of the conflict of interest, you should have something that, kind of the whole process of completing the process. In this case, for a conflict of interest, it's primarily the board. Could be staff in that situation that may have a conflict of interest. Most of the time it's related party transactions. So in that example where the board member owned the property and the organization was renting that property, there would be a conflict of interest because it was a related party transaction. Now, just because there's a conflict of interest is not going to be unlawful. What happens in your conflict of interest, if you identify that person, what you do is you basically, anything that has to do with that kind of conflict, that board member cannot vote on. Everybody else can, and they can decide on procurements or other things like that. But it takes that person out of the management side, which could be then a real conflict in that area. So you look at that. What are kind of related party transactions? It's anybody that has a financial and material interest in the organization in that situation. And that could be either family members, associates, family members all the way down to, let's say, siblings or other things like that, that would be benefiting from the organization's contract or procurement with that vendor. That's what happens. Accepting gifts and having stock in companies is also considered a conflict of interest. Conflict of interest should be reviewed at least annually. And a good portion of the time where it might be more than annually is if a board member comes in, you got a brand new board member that comes in because somebody else has left. then they should go ahead and use the document that you decide, a form, which is one of the how-tos, to address any potential conflict of interest. Here's a flow chart that would be a how-to document. So as you see that, we identify the conflict of interest. How do we do that? That could be in a board meeting. It could be on a form, anything that does that. Then the part is to identify it. What is the conflict? If there is a conflict, then you go upward, and it, like I talked about before, you just don't have that person vote on it. If there's no conflict, then naturally all boards can vote on whatever procurement that happens. These things actually happen a lot in more the rural areas, like West Texas or Panhandle or anywhere else that's rural, where your nonprofit is in a real small town, and the only vendor in that town happens to be on the board because it's such a small town in that direction. Well, you want to make sure that that board member doesn't vote on those things. And you may look at it for supplies, you may go somewhere else. Or in the other part is that you can show that even though it's a conflict of interest, you got a substantial discount so that it was not a true conflict. They gave you something because a lot of times most board members are vested in the organization and want to do something for the organization, so they may charge less just to help the organization. It's still a conflict of interest. You still need to identify it, memorialize it, but then that's not something that would be non-compliance if you can demonstrate the other part. Now, mandatory disclosure, this happens seldom, but when it does happen, it's very significant. So what happens in here, a lot of it could be fraud, waste, and abuse, but it's really more fraud, bribery, gratuity violations that, somebody within that organization is getting something out of it that nonprofits shouldn't be providing in that situation. So it's something that is personal gain. Those kind of things, why they put it in that direction, is that it fits into the federal criminal code in that area. So, bribery could be a federal crime, things like that. Anything that's kind of the federal crime, the organization needs to, in a timely manner, notify either the federal agency or the pass-through entity that you've got the grant. That's very significant in this situation. How often does it happen? I'd say rare, but when it does happen, you need to know, and you need to have a policy and procedures. What do we do if we find this out? Well, here's our mandatory disclosure. What is it? So there's your policy identifying what is a federal criminal law. Then in your procedures, you go down and you start the process of identifying, providing process for staff to identify and report any violations of crime like that internally to the CEO. From there, the CEO will discuss with the attorney to determine if those perceived violations are valid. If they're not, then you stop there. If they are valid, then you need, the CEO would need to disclose it to the board members for any potential violation. And then finally, if it is to that point, then the organization needs to disclose it to the funder, whether it's the federal agency or the pass-through entity. A pass-through entity in a lot of federal grants would be like VOCA with the governor's office, HHSC for the family violence program in that direction. For the OAG would be the part of rape prevention education dollars that are federally passed through to the agency. So depending on where you get your funds, that's who you need to provide to it. Now, the part of that is that what is timely? One of the things with the new 2 CFR, the update to it, federal agencies, but also the pass-through entities, want programs to provide notifications sooner than what they've normally had to do. And I understand why organizations will say, wait, we don't want to jump the gun if we don't know if it's a true violation, especially a violation that's criminal, and subject our organization to even more scrutiny from the funder when we're not sure what's going on. It could be an act that's not substantiated, other things like that. The other part that I would see with local programs is, well, we want to make sure, we want to make absolutely sure before we submit something, because if it's false, we could be sued by whoever we claim that was having that criminal event in that situation. So I understand the hesitancy of the organizations, and the funders do too, but they want to be caught up earlier than they have been before. That's why in the new update, they've kind of pushed it to try to move people to identify that and notify them sooner than they have been. The last part would be our policies and procedures for travel. Travel is historically one of those where another area where a lot of findings can happen, because there's a lot of things that are happening at one time. Cost, travel itineraries that may change, other things like that happen that get your staff and your organization out of compliance. So you need to have a policy that would work with your travel. And how do you do that? Well, one of the policies is, first of all, that you comply with the federal travel procedures for transportation, lodging, per diem, any related costs that's to that official business. What is official business? It's the official business of the organization. Let's say you're going to training or you're giving training, other things like that. That's the official business. If you're going to a meeting that's required, or even a meeting, that's still a business, official business. That's where you go through. But as you can see, the policy is still pretty short and broad. The procedure then gets into a little bit more of that. So the staff needs to obtain, supervisory approval for any potential travel. We do that, when we're going to do some traveling. Let's say with Roger going on site, he would need to then go to our supervisor, tell him where he's going, what the engagements for, everything like that, for the approval. And once he starts to get that approval, or I get the approval, then we identify all the potential costs that's associated to it. And then the supervisor actually reviews it. We have a form that really fits all this in our how-tos. And then upon completion of the travel, then the staff needs to timely report all the costs to the supervisor for approval, and then to the supervisor to get it to the financial in that situation. And then the close in that whole process would be the financial staff will reconcile the approved travel cost and timely reimburse the staff. This area is always kind of tough for organizations, and I know for financial people. Trying to get staff to timely submit their travel costs after the fact is something like herding cats a lot of times. It should be timely, to me, is a week. You may find people that are not pushed enough and they wait a month or two. Well, one of the problems with waiting that long is your travel associated in that cost should, when the auditor looks at it and says, well, the cost was in May, but it was almost October before the cost was actually reviewed, expended, and then also reimbursed. There's that timing issue of those things. One thing that it does more than anything, it puts the program more in jeopardy because of cash flow. How many organizations can actually wait 2 or 3 months because they've already paid for that travel cost, but they don't get reimbursed until such and such time? And a lot of times staff can't connect the dots, or don't connect the dots that, oh, when I finish the travel and it's $500, or If it's a flight, let's say out of state, it could be $1,000, $5,000. It could be a lot of different things like that. The organization has to pay for it and sits there not getting reimbursed for it. That works on the cash flow of the organization, which then some are very, very tight, and it's hard to meet payroll at that time, everything else. So that's where in this procedure, you really want the supervisors to stay on top of that timely reporting, and for that supervisor to truly review it and get it passed on to the financial. So that's your procedure on travel. How-to documents in this situation, like talked about before, we have approved travel forms that we must submit. We submit it prior to travel so that we can get the approval of the travel. And then after we complete the travel, we use still the same form to identify all the costs and everything else. And then our supervisor approves that and then sends it down to financial for the review and approval for any potential reimbursement back to the employee, but also to capture that all those expenses that were borne by the organization. A lot of times what we will do is on our travel, if we know that that person's going to be there for 2 days, the supervisor can use the corporate card to lock down and secure lodging and things like that. That would be costs. Another one would be the rental car. Those things that are still a cost to the organization and could be a potential of that, that part of how long it will take to get reimbursed for it. So, we use our how-to document to kind of work on those two things more than we do with the procedure. The procedures just documents the whole process and the completing of the process from the beginning to the end. But here, on your how-tos, that's the more detailed part in there. And, on any of those forums, you can see how detailed it is, where you're going, what city, everything else like that. Is it training? Is it something else like a meeting or anything else like that? And then you start to put in the potential cost and everything. And then afterwards, then you give the true cost. So it's a nice document that we use in that situation. Any kind of questions? This is just the first part. I thought these policies and procedures were kind of really important, whether it's because of the cost itself and the potential of findings. You want to have those policies and procedures. Or in the other part is now that 2CFR has really worked on implementing internal controls, fraud, waste, abuse, any kind of criminal activity, those things identified as something that may not happen, but it's devastating if it does, if you do not comply with those things. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah,
at
Mark,
this time?
we have several questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay.
There are a couple of them about getting, of course, the handout of this presentation and the recording. I guess the recording will be available on YouTube in a couple of weeks.
Yes. Yes.
And
our IT person will contact me when it's up there and will give me the link, and then I will send it out through the listserv and everything. One of the things to address about the handouts, some people may have come in because their supervisor or CEO or whoever said, we'd like for you to attend this. So you may not be on my financial listserv. If you want to be involved in that, send me an email and I will add you to the financial listserv. That financial listserv is used to notify people of training, notify people of anything that we think is relevant and needs to be talked about before even the training comes about. A lot of times that's something new in the federal guidelines or even state guidelines, things like that. And then naturally, besides getting a registration through the listserv, then you're on the listserv so that when we send out the handout, you'll get it. But if you didn't get it this time, please email me. Let me go down to, there's my information. So you can email me and say, Mark, I'd like to be on the financial listserv, and here's my information. And then I will put you on the listserv, so that way, anytime we do have, like we're going to do for part 2, you'll be on that listserv, and then you'll automatically get a notification on that. What we're doing is that I wanted to finish part 1 before we send out the registration link for part 2, because I didn't want to confuse people with, oh, well, this email is the same as the other, without really seeing that, oh, it's part 1, part 2, and it's in different dates. So expect to get a notification from me on tomorrow when I send that out. We will set up the time and everything for it so that we can secure that time with Zoom and everything in that process, and you'll get that. The other thing, that if you were involved in this and it was a one-time event, but you somehow got in on our listserv, you won't hurt my feelings if you just email me and say, Mark, I don't really need to be on your listserv. Please take me off. No questions asked. We'll take care of it. So I know that the listserv is big and cumbersome because it could be a lot of people. It could be, CEOs, EDs, financial people, program people that want to be involved in, or like that, or need for compliance. And then other program people that, oh, well, it was my ED that decided it was a good idea and put me on the listserv. But, we've got our financial people to take care of that, or other things like that for compliance, and may not really need to be. So it's kind of one catch fits all. And just let me know when you need to be off of it in that situation.
So another question, Mark, is
Okay.
what's an example of an internal control situation that could lead someone reaching out to the state auditor's office?
There's a couple of different things that could happen. One, if your internal controls are not strong and it's provided to all the programs, I've seen a lot of situations where a staff member doesn't understand grants and can't understand why one program gets more money than another program, and then thinks that it's favoritism and all kinds of stuff, and then gets into the mindset that, oh, they're committing fraud with that money. And really, it wasn't the true understanding of how those things work. School districts were like that. I know in a lot of nonprofits that I used to investigate, it was the communication itself. And a lot of times the squeaky wheel may go up, but without understanding why, they don't get a resolution, and then they send it to the state auditor's office. And from there, then it's sent to, like at TA, it was to Roger and I. We have to look at that, then we have to do some investigation. Then we find out, well, it was really bad communication on all parties and didn't get there. That's the nice one, in one sense, that it was just miscommunication. The other part could be, right out fraud or theft in that situation. We had a situation with, let's say, a supervisor of maintenance that had bought a lot of equipment at one time, and more significant than the school district's size and everything else. And you wonder about that. And what you find out is that that supervisor of maintenance was actually building his own inventory that he can either sell to other people, or had a side business that he would use it in that direction. Well, that's fraud in that situation. And people didn't get the resolution from the school district, and everybody else got to TEA, to the state auditor's office, SAO, It was then sent to us. We started looking into it, and oh, by the way, we found out that allegation was true. And you go through that. There's a lot of different things that can go that direction, not only for school districts, but for a lot of the nonprofits. So I actually had, when I was investigating at the OAG, a hospital that was defrauding the insurance and patients at the same time. And in that case, we got involved. We found out that it was actually true. Part of it was that one of the first things we did was look at the contracts of the financial people, and the people that were the debt collectors got an incentive for how much debt they would get back and everything. And the supervisor was getting a huge incentive payment. Well, what was actually happening was that when the patient went to the hospital and then they got out, they might have primary and secondary insurance. Both insurances pay for that patient, but then what that debt collectors and the whole group would say, well, we're just going to shift that. We're going to kite it, as they say, move it over to another patient that didn't pay. And it makes it look like we had actually done our job very well and collected so much debt, when in the contracts, and I know they got in more trouble with the IRS and the insurance cases than they actually did with the Attorney General's office, because IRS got them for fraud. The insurance companies got them for fraud because there were some things in there whether they didn't pay, they didn't return the money to the secondary, or in a case where I saw this, it was very funny. The invoice was supposed to be for $100, and there was a clerical mistake, and it turned out to be $1,000. And then another one that was $1,000 that turned out to be $10,000. Well, then just pocket it. They just put it in, and then they'd get their bonuses because they looked so good. And the board of the hospital thought they were their saviors, because they were doing, they went from like 50% debt of not collecting to down to about 10%. And they had increased revenue by, what was that? I think we could only prove 2.5 million at the time that we were doing the review. What we suspect was probably 5 to 10 million. But proving it in court was a different story. And then what happened is that later on, the insurance company would come back because they saw the lawsuit, they saw everything else, and they had their lawsuits on the hospital for fraud to the hospital, to the insurance, which then the hospital had to pay back, and it's just damaging to all. Another question?
Yeah, the last one, Mark. What should the process be for supervisors and directors when it comes to time and effort tracking?
It should be the same as any other employee. Now, it depends on the organization itself. That let's say in my case, as my job is to provide technical assistance, so there isn't as much of my effort that's in there. Now, my time is there for the 40 hours. How do we do that? When I say by the organization, some organizations are very, how do I want to put this, which would be nice, is micromanaging. Let's put it that way. They want to know the specific time a person came in, and oh, by the way, we don't want you to come in 15 minutes before you're supposed to, and oh, by the way, you can't leave until 15 minutes ahead of time from where you're supposed to. They're micromanaging in that situation. When a good organization says, give me 40 hours, we have an 8 to 5 or other things, or some flex time, report it. So it depends on, for the managers, what type of organization you're in, and what are the incremental factors for that. So it may be that for time, you're showing your 40 hours for your effort, it might be that you're showing a couple of different things like administrative, you're doing administrative things, you're supervising, you're doing other things. And other times you're doing the actual work, which would be another. What I like and what we've done and kind of recommended to programs, even if they have spreadsheets, use a code that says, like accompaniment might be ACE, A for accompaniment, or anything else like that. For another that is doing training would be TR, would be other things that happen. Counseling might be C, or it might be that, let's say for a counselor, there's group counseling and just individual counseling. You might have IC as individual counseling. Those would be what you use to track your effort in that situation. Is that helpful? For the person that asked that question, let me know if you need more information. You can always contact me and we can discuss that, because it is different from organization to organization.
Mark, I would just like to add the very best thing the supervisors can do is to, number one, lay out a good time and effort process, have the policies and procedures, how the employees should be reporting their time. And if you have a good process laid out for them and also keep checking how they're doing, you should also have a good reconciliation process, because time and effort basically that's how you get paid. So you want to make sure that your time and effort matches with your payroll. So I think I would start with looking at it to see what process you have, whether you have an electronics process, whether you have, on paper. Just look at the process that you have, provide lots and lots of training to your employees, because without good training, they would really don't know what forms to fill out or when to fill out or how to report their time and effort. So I think good process and good training are the two essential elements of being a good supervisory duty for time and effort.
I absolutely agree with you, Roger. That's a good process to follow. If that's helpful, great. If you need more information, just contact me, email me, call me, or anything, and we can discuss that further in a little bit more detail. Because a lot of times it does happen to be, organization specific. And what we've given you, especially Roger, has given you very good broad information in there, but sometimes broad stuff don't fit to that specific need in one sense. So contact us.
One more question on that. I think it's the question says the hourly employees, we have it down. It's the salaried employees, they get a little bit more complicated, especially allocations across the multiple grants. And I think, there is an additional question, what resource or templates do you recommend outside of 2 CFR that ensures compliance? You want to take it, Mark, or?
Yeah, I would set up, like I said, a how-to document to do that. Now that could be a sample of your paper document, time and effort, with samples in there and discussions, and then training in that direction. If it's in electronic like we did training on that. We still, supervisor comes back and say, well, I have a question about this. On the effort part might be, I have a question on the code. You used TR or TA or some other thing. Or in my case, because I'm not doing as much grants management as I was doing before, Roger does a lot of the grants management. Grants management is helping with the operations of the organization, of each of the organizations that we fund, budget adjustments, time and effort at certain times, other things like that are more, grants management in that situation. And he might, if I put a GM in there, and I don't normally do that, my supervisor will then just text me or email me, I have a question on GM on such and such date. and things like that. But no, you use that's where I like the how-to document. You can explain more in that direction. And you can change it. Let's say the first month or two, it seemed like a good system, but everybody still had problems with it and you had to change it up. Well, and those kind of how-tos, you can change the how-tos without having to go back in the review process and approval process, which may take a month or longer, depending on your organization.
I think the second part of the question is what resource or templates do you recommend outside of the 2 CFR that ensures compliance? So I think one of the good resources, the trainings like this one, that you can get a lot of information. The 2 CFR 200 is the guiding law, and so we really cannot deviate from that. Mark, anything you want to add to that?
Well, you actually did the time and effort
I did.
seminar
Right.
back in August. It is recorded and it was the only one that made it through. I still need to get the link to that so I can send it out to everybody. And if you want to review Roger's webinar and you still have questions, then you can contact me first, and then I will work with Roger on any kind of supplemental information that we can give you at that point. I think a lot of times, if you're kind of concerned in that direction, it might be more an organizational thing. So I would recommend that you just contact me and say, Mark, in an email, I'd like to discuss time and effort a little bit further than the webinars that we've seen. And I'll go, great. Well, we can either set up a conference call or we can set up a Zoom, and then we can work out all those details that may be more specific to your organization than other situations. And it would also help us, okay, now I will understand the issue clearer, and maybe I can find something that could be beneficial to you. So please send me an email on that and I will work with you. That's my job. I always in the thing that, my job is technical assistance. And if I love providing technical assistance to programs, and one of the things that's hard for me is reading the citations for hours at a time. So you could help me by just contacting me and say, Mark, I need to discuss such and such topic. I go, oh, great, I can stop reading the boring text and help somebody. That's my favorite part of the job. And I know that's Roger's favorite too, that we like to be able to provide assistance than just reading citation after citation. There's, just in the 2 CFR, I think there's about 500 pages because it has the 2 CFR and the appendix and everything else. But then we look at other things that are, grant specific to a particular federal grant or other things. That's an awful lot of reading.
I think that's all we have, Mark.
Okay. Well,
you want to stop the recording right after this, right?
Yeah, so let me stop share and then see where the recording is. Here we go. Yes.